Hey, what's up guys? This is Aleks Petakov here, director of the Beyond the Trail series, as well as a variety of other series here at Small Town Monsters, including Strange Places, among others. In case you didn't know who I was, there's your intro. I want to do something different for this episode of Beyond the Trail. So what we're going to be doing is kind of behind the trail. I had thought about doing a sort of director's commentary sort of thing, mixed with a little bit of a kind of behind the scenes sort of thing. We've been doing Beyond the Trail, Bigfoot Beyond the Trail now since 2021. So it's been quite a few years. We have obviously quite a few episodes out, a ton of them. So for this episode, we're going to watch clips from a variety of Beyond the Trails over the years. I've kind of picked 2 or so from each year. So starting in 2021 up until the current year, now 2024. And I thought it'd be fun to share some stories. Obviously, we filmed so many of these episodes, and there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes that doesn't necessarily make the video. I mean, you got to understand a lot of these videos are just basically my personal investigations and my adventures out into a variety of places in North America. And so there's obviously a lot that goes into it, whether it's a trip to Alaska or Florida or wherever it may be. There's a lot that happens that just doesn't make the hour-long video or however long the episode happens to be. So I thought it'd be really cool to kind of jot my memory a little bit, share some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that's gone on over the years. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of share those stories. We'll watch the video together, and I'll sort of pause and bring up any details that kind of come to mind. So we're going to start with the Granite State Bigfoot from 2021. Now this was the first ever episode of Beyond the Trail, or Bigfoot Beyond the Trail. Basically, this episode was sort of a pilot almost. Seth Breedlove and I had kind of been shooting around ideas about doing some sort of series on YouTube or just something to kind of focus on the Bigfoot topic. We have this series called On the Trail of Bigfoot. Now that is a series that has been going on for quite a few years as well. So we sort of decided this was going to be an offshoot of that, but totally its own thing. So that's where the On the Trail versus the Beyond the Trail sort of title came from. So that's why we chose to go with Beyond the Trail. And this first episode I did in January of 2021. That's when I filmed it. And it was basically just a pilot. It was kind of like, let's see what happens. To start out, this was an investigation or a case that I had been working for a number of years prior to any of this Beyond the Trail stuff. So I felt it was a natural place to jump in and start kind of filming an episode and kind of try to develop the style. And you'll see as we go through it how much the Beyond the Trail sort of format has changed in some ways and hasn't in other ways. So what I'll do is I'm going to start watching about halfway through the episode, and we're going to kind of watch a little sequence, and I'll pause and comment, and we'll discuss as we go along. So here we go.
After talking to Chris, Dave, and Crystal, I decided to invite Josh out in order to spend a night in the spot and investigate it further. It was going to be a cold winter night, but we were definitely prepared.
So this is interesting. This episode, when we were planning to film it, we had found a date. This was with my friend Josh, who was kind of investigating this case with me at the time. We picked probably one of the coldest days and nights of the entirety of 2021. I live here in New Hampshire. It gets very cold in the winter up here in the northern part of the kind of northeast up here. So we packed a lot of gear, and I remember getting a lot of comments, people saying, oh my God, you guys had all that gear for one night. Well, as you can see, as I'll showcase the gear now, yeah, it was like supposed to be 7 degrees that night and during the day. So, I mean, it was absolutely frigid. So that's why we had so much gear for just one night spent out. All right, so this is the gear we're going to be bringing out. Obviously, there's a lot of it. There's clothes and tents and tripods. I'm not going to show that. It's going to be very cold, so we have lots of hand warmers, foot warmers, general warmers. You got your first aid kit with all the essentials, bandage to stop bleeding, some tinder, fire starting stuff, some emergency heat in a can. You can see that if it'll focus, yeah. Heat blankets, very important. You might line the tent with that. Spare heat blankets. Little camping stove. So this is a little guy that you put onto these little kind of gas cans, which is nice. Lighter fluid. It's very cold, so we're going to have to kind of work with what we have here. Obviously hatchets, portable shovel. I think this is always useful. Extra fire starting stuff. This is kind of neat. It's a little starts a little spark, so it's kind of cool. Extra saw. This is a
handheld saw. What else? Glow stick. More into the gear side of stuff, we're going to be bringing some walkies just in case we happen to split up a little bit. Obviously some protection, just your standard 9mm. With this one actually has a flashlight and a laser on it, so just self-protection just in case. So when I laid out the gear, I thought it'd be cool to do a sort of gear demonstration. That's just an idea I had. You got to realize this is the first ever episode. I didn't really know what I was doing. I just kind of, up until this point as a filmmaker, I've primarily been behind the camera. So I'd been doing kind of independent Sasquatch investigations and research and that sort of stuff here in the Northeast for a number of years up until this point. But I hadn't really filmed myself. It wasn't about me. When I did documentaries, it was like on the trail of champ type stuff, where it's profiling researchers, going out to locations. I wasn't really part of it. So this was an interesting kind of step into filming myself and putting myself into an episode. So I didn't really know how to go about it. So that's kind of why I chose to highlight the gear in this way. Yeah, so I'm watching this now. So many episodes have obviously gone on since then. I'm trying to kind of see in the early days, you're trying to find your style, you're trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. I don't think it really, you figure out your own style, and it always evolves, at least I find as a filmmaker and a researcher. But this for me was kind of tricky because it was such a case, it was a case that I had known so well and had been working for a few years and kind of investigating this area. And it's covered pretty well in the episode, but I was trying to find a balance between talking about the case, the investigation, interviews with some of the witnesses and people involved in the previous investigations, and trying to balance that with this kind of boots on the ground investigation, going out for one night, which obviously I think is not super effective one night. But again, this was just sort of stylistically, we were trying to figure out how to make this work. Plus the weather being as brutal as it was in January, it's tricky to find a good time of year there. But yeah, it's interesting just watching this now, almost 4 years later, seeing how much has changed and how some things have stayed the same.
England was actually completely logged out hundreds of years ago, and it's all recovered forest now. So you'll find these in the woods just all over the place.
Just an interesting fact about the woods here in New England. All right, so let's check this out here. So you got all these trees kind of mangled up here. I'm gonna get over here to get a little bit of a better angle. Now, some people might say that this is what you'd call a tree structure, right?
Yeah.
Which is, you know, supposedly Bigfoot activity. So tree structures, I found this a while ago. So when it comes to tree structures, even now, years later, I'm still pretty skeptical. I've seen very little tree structures that kind of convinced me that this was actually anomalous or strange, especially in a place here like New Hampshire where you have that heavy snow load in the winters and that sort of stuff. I really haven't seen much tree structure-wise that's been very compelling or convincing. Maybe some of the Olympic Project nest kind of stuff, although that's not necessarily a tree structure. I would argue that's something different. But yeah, even all these years later, I've seen plenty of pictures and alleged structures and that sort of stuff, and nothing that's really been super convincing to me. And there's very few sightings with alleged tree structure activity, so that's something I always kind of keep in mind.
Did the trees originate in this area?
Yeah, it's funny because I mean they're dead. There's no limbs on them. You know, this is one of those things where this is what you're gonna find out in the middle of the woods out here off trail. I mean, this is, you know, things can just kind of occur naturally, and this is what you get. But still, nonetheless, it's kind of interesting to take a second look at it and, you know, just try to figure out, okay, you know, what might have caused it in the first place.
All right, yeah, so there's that from Granite State Bigfoot. I'm going to move on to a different episode. Just, it's cool to see the origins of Beyond the Trail and kind of where it started. That's why I wanted to talk a little bit about this particular episode, again, going all the way back to 2021. Next one we're going to look at is Bigfoot Mountain. This is also from 2021, but this is a few episodes in. So to give you an example, I'd filmed, the Granite State Bigfoot case was filmed in early 2021 in January. This was filmed in July and came out, I think, in September or something like that, September, October. So we're already a few episodes in at this point. There's Sasquatch in the Pine Tree State, there was Bigfoot at Bluff Creek, and then there was this one, which was Bigfoot Mountain, which is filmed on the same trip as this Bluff Creek trip. But there was a lot of crazy stuff that happened behind the scenes. This was a 2-week-long road trip I did with Eli at the time, with going to the Pacific Northwest, lots of driving in between, lots of crazy adventures. And there's a particular incident in this episode that I wanted to talk about that we'll highlight here in a moment. But this episode, was really cool about it is I obviously was there for the filming, but I didn't edit this one. Eli actually edited this one at the time. We were kind of splitting some of the episodes. This episode, I didn't know how it was going to come out. So what I'll do is I'll play this little sequence and then we'll discuss it, because it was definitely a weird one. Okay, so this was weird. This was really weird.
We set up camp and there's these like this weird ritual thing going on here. We saw some weird person on the road. I mean, you saw him. It was some strange stuff.
I didn't see it,
So
but
I think we're gonna get the heck out of here. There's like
really
tiki
weird.
torches on over here.
Okay, this was a really weird incident. Definitely kind of creepy, but the backstory is we are camping at this location. It's actually featured in a book called The Oregon Bigfoot Highway by Joe Bielart. It's a pretty interesting encounter in this location in which a guy had a sighting with his sons while fishing, and this Sasquatch creature was apparently pushing them out and was aggressive. He actually used his fishing rod to defend himself, and this thing actually used its hand to push the fishing rod away. So goes the story. So we thought, hey, this would be a cool place to camp. So we go to this spot. We notice there's a truck parked there, and this is the middle of nowhere, Mount Hood National Forest. There's an old bridge there, and we're parked there, and there's a red truck just kind of sitting there. You know, we thought, oh, maybe someone's fishing, whatever. And there's a little kind of, the road goes around to this old bridge, and there's a little campsite down beneath the road. So that's where we set up our tents, and you can see it in that one shot where you see these torches off in the distance. So we set up, there's a bunch of us there with some of Cliff Barrickman's guys from the North American Bigfoot Center Museum. They're the ones that kind of recommended this spot. So we're just hanging out. We've been there for a couple hours, and then a few of us are sitting up at the truck. You can see it in that one shot. We're just kind of sitting there hanging out. And all of a sudden, some dude just walks out of a bush. And you can see it actually it was captured on a dash cam. This dude, lanky looking dude, I don't know, look kind of emaciated from my memory. This weird outfit, like this vest with this gold stuff on it. Really strange. Not something you expect in the middle of nowhere in the wilderness. Sure, Oregon is a bit of a weird place, but not something you expect. We're all standing there. There's a few of us there, and there's a couple other people down in camp. And we're all looking at each other like, what is going on? Who is this guy? And one of the guys with us just blurts out, hey, going for an evening stroll? And the dude just sort of says, yeah. Walks past us, and we're standing there looking at each other like, what is this guy doing here? And one of the guys there says, there's nothing down that way. It just, the bridge just goes on, and it's just wilderness. You know, why would you be taking a stroll? I mean, he walked out of the woods. I saw him from right behind where I was looking. Actually, he walked out of the woods, just walked right out, middle of the tree line, just walked out. He looked kind of surprised to see us, so that was a little bit suspicious. He walks past us. We have the video of it from the from the dash cam. That was kind of weird. He just walks past us, and we're sort of thinking, okay, just unusual. What do we do? And as the dark starts falling, we notice these tiki torches on in the distance and people kind of singing in a sort of circle, and it seemed really weird. At one point, one of us goes up to the truck and looks in and says, oh my God, there's animal bones hanging in the truck. They're painted gold and pentagrams, and it just looked really weird. His outfit was off. The dude gave off a really weird vibe. You're in the middle of nowhere in the wilderness. A bunch of us are planning on camping there. I start kind of sneaking around in the bushes a little bit, try to see if I can see anything in their camp or see what's going on. We don't want to share this spot with people because we're out there looking for Bigfoot activity. Having other people right close to you, not what you want. Plus the weirdness of this situation. And I find these little trails there in the woods that go, and one of them leads right up to where this guy popped out of the woods on us. And I took the trail up and I go back to the road, and I realize when you're standing on the road, you can look down into camp and see it. But when you're down in that camp, the way the hill works and you're looking up at the road, you can't see the road. So it kind of creates this effect that if you're up there, you can kind of spy on people in there. And I think my personal theory was that he was trying to scope out what we were doing, what we were up to, why were we there? Maybe they were doing some kind of ritual. I don't know. We joke it was an encounter with these weird Satanist people. It was enough for us to want to get out of there, and that's exactly what we did. I don't know what this seance, Sasquatch seance, who the hell knows?
Load. Freaking goal, man.
Oh no, Ron went crazy.
Yeah, so it was a weird encounter. Definitely not something you want to happen when you're out in the middle of the wilderness. As you can see, we relocated to a different spot. We went to an even cooler spot. Ended up being an awesome location, beautiful view of a valley. But yeah, it was funny again watching this because I didn't get to edit this, so I didn't know how it was going to turn out. And Eli edited this, and he added some pretty fitting music in there, so I thought that was kind of cool. But it's definitely one of those scenarios where you're not exactly comfortable, and this happens when you're out in these kind of wild areas and you run into people, and that's kind of the biggest threat I always feel is out there are weird people, weird things you don't want to deal with. You want to go out in the woods, serenity with nature. If you're looking for Sasquatch, you're trying to enjoy nature and really get out there and not deal with strange people. But unfortunately, there's weird people everywhere. That's another reason to be safe when out in the wilderness. We didn't feel comfortable in that situation, so that's exactly why we left. And even though just a little snippet of it was in the video, the backstory, obviously, very kind of weird, unusual. They could have just been doing their own thing, minding their own business, but they just looked strange. The guy looked off, and none of us felt comfortable with that scenario. And again, the wilderness is big enough that we could find a place where we're not going to share it with people doing whatever they were doing. And they were also breaking the law because they were technically doing a fire and having a fire during a fire ban. So that's another reason you don't want to be near that kind of situation. So yeah, that's Bigfoot Mountain, the little behind the scenes story there from Bigfoot Mountain. So yeah, with that said, we'll move on to another episode now and kind of keep the behind the trail going. Now we're going to look at Bridgewater Triangle Bigfoot. This is from 2022. So this was, obviously the show had grown quite a bit. We've been doing more filming in different areas, and this was a really cool episode for me. Because again, this is an area I had investigated previously, and I had known people that have investigated it for decades. It's in the so-called Bridgewater Triangle, and what that is it's an area in southeastern Massachusetts, kind of beneath Boston. It was coined by Lauren Coleman, a world-famous cryptozoologist, back in the 70s, and it was just sort of this geographic area that had a lot of weird anomalous stuff reported in it. Whether you believe in it or not, doesn't matter. It's just an area where stuff is reported. So it kind of earned the nickname Bridgewater Triangle, even though it's technically not really a triangle. It's got more geographical kind of phenomena going on in different areas. So the triangle is just easy. We love triangles and shapes, and that's something, especially triangles, they get associated with mysteries a lot. Bermuda Triangle, Bridgewater Triangle, Alaska Triangle, you name it. That's kind of become a thing in sort of paranormal circles. So Bridgewater Triangle, I had been there for years. I used to work in the Boston area, so I would sometimes go down there after work and kind of investigate. What's so cool about the Bridgewater Triangle is it's sort of a smorgasbord of different paranormal and weird things. You've got hauntings, ghost stories, cryptid stories, Bigfoot stories, gruesome true crime murder kind of stuff, mob hits, alleged cult activity, strange creatures, just everything. I mean, it doesn't matter what you believe in or what you're into, there's something in the Bridgewater Triangle for basically everybody. So that's why I really wanted to focus on it. Some of the Bigfoot stories in particular in the Bridgewater Triangle are particularly interesting, including the alleged creature that was lifting this cruiser, and that's this clip we're going to talk about here in a moment.
There's one story of a Bigfoot being seen eating a pumpkin in a crouched position. And one night a cruiser was sitting out back. Yes, man, we got the details. Yep, you saw some sort of hairy ape. Yep, Yogi Bear's out there getting picnic baskets. Well, he's on watch. And suddenly he feels his cruiser rock back and forth, and he puts his foot instinctively on the brake, and behind, with the glow of the red lights, is a hairy torso.
And he said the thing was, he saw in the rearview mirror, it was kind of strange because it was dark, but it actually picked up the back of his cruiser and dropped it.
This illustration here is probably one of my favorites ever done of a Bigfoot-like creature, and this was done specifically for this episode by super talented artist Jonathan Dodd. He's actually been in one of our Beyond the Trail episodes. He does a lot of artwork for Small Town Monsters, a lot of the Kickstarter stuff. He just does a really cool job, and I said if there was a Bigfoot picture to get framed and put up, it would be this one. I might actually do that. I mean, it's just so cool the way it came out. And it's obviously based on this story of this kind of cruiser creature.
And he said what he called, he didn't want to be ridiculed, a bipedal bear run around the side of the house, and he took a searchlight and he saw it.
This was another piece of art basically in the same sequence as that lifting creature, also done by Jonathan Dodd. Came out amazingly as well. So as you can see, I mean, it was just super cool to include that in the episode.
And so he considered retreat the better part of valor, and he went back to headquarters. We talked on the phone. I never actually met him, but he told me pretty much that was pretty much all there was to it. That it picked up the back of his cruiser. Obviously, it must have been extremely strong, and all he could see in the rearview mirror with the low light as it was with just his hair. He wasn't aware that other officers had witnessed that, but he's still very, very reluctant to talk about that.
So the person interviewed here is Paulino, a friend of mine. Unfortunately, he recently passed away, which has been a real big bummer to me, but I was really glad to include him in this story because he had firsthand experience of talking to this officer who claimed to have his cruiser lifted. And the other guy interviewed previously was John Horrigan, another friend of mine who has been investigating the Bridgewater Triangle for decades, in the 90s, and basically has just covered a lot of that and was very familiar with this story, which is I haven't heard very many Bigfoot stories like this where a creature lifts the cruiser up. I mean, that's obviously something very hard to fake if it indeed is sort of a hoax or a prank. Good luck finding, maybe like some kind of bodybuilder or something to lift a car like that. I mean, you can imagine back in the day in the 60s, those police cruisers, they were pretty heavy. So that's not something a bear or something else is really going to be able to do in that time period or that area. So very weird story.
We never were able to talk to the officer when we did the Bridgewater Triangle documentary. He had long since passed. And I'll never forget one screening in Bridgewater when we were screening the film when it first came out. The daughter of that cop showed up at the screening, and she's like, "That was my father. He was the cop who, cruiser was lifted up off the back by the Bigfoot creature." She said that absolutely happened. That wasn't a fabricated story.
It was really cool to include the clip of Aaron Cadieux. He directed the Bridgewater Triangle documentary, and he was interviewed throughout this film, but he brought that anecdotal story of meeting the daughter of that officer, so it just kind of added another layer to that particular encounter. One of my favorite sort of Bigfoot stories of the cruiser lifting creature. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about some other stuff from this episode, which I thought were really cool, so we'll proceed to that segment right now.
You can be in New Bedford or the city of Fall River or the city of Taunton, and in 20 minutes you can be in the state forest and you're in the middle of nowhere. It tends to draw in strange people. People who want to hide stuff from drug dealing to stolen cars to even major crimes like homicide. It's a dumping ground, basically. Including human bodies.
The people that do believe that the Bridgewater Triangle is this entity claim that the negative energy that the triangle emits draws in the bizarre, strange crimes that happen in the Freetown State Forest. And there's been a long history of that kind of thing there, ranging from mob hits of people leaving bodies in there.
We found a newborn baby. It was in a trash barrel off the side of 24. And during the autopsy, they indicated that the baby was alive when it was put there and died from exposure. And
wow, this was a very disturbing interview, probably one of the most disturbing of the people I've interviewed, because some people might be asking, well, what does this have to do with Bigfoot? Why is it in a Bigfoot documentary? When it comes to a place like the Bridgewater Triangle, I feel like you can't talk about the Bigfoot element or the sightings without talking about the other weird stuff. As we mentioned earlier about the Bridgewater Triangle being this sort of area with a lot of weird stuff going on in it. Paranormal, cryptid, criminal, there's a lot of different things going on there. And I just remember during this interview, you could have heard a pin drop when he was talking about discovering the newborn. And this gentleman was a former detective in Freetown, Massachusetts, so he covered the Freetown forest. He was there for a lot of this sort of stuff. It was really creepy hearing that perspective from law enforcement and somebody that was on the scene for a lot of this kind of stuff.
the baby wasn't more than 24 hours old.
Very famous case in 1978, a guy named James Cater had abducted a girl from Raynham named Mary Lou Arruda. She was a 15-year-old girl, kidnapped her while she was riding her bike. Months later, she was found tied to a tree and had been sexually assaulted and murdered, and she was found in the Freetown State Forest. That's probably the most famous murder to have happened in the Freetown State Forest.
That one really affected me, and I was the first officer on the scene, and I had to stay there and rope it off and wait for everybody else to show up. So I was all alone in the forest with a dead body, and that kind of sticks out more than anything else, I would say.
That, I can't imagine that, being the first person on the scene of a murder like that and having to witness that and waiting for backup, basically. I've worked with a lot of law enforcement guys in the Bigfoot topic, people that have a law enforcement background or have worked in that sort of field and now kind of do Bigfoot investigating, so they bring those skills. I'll talk to them about some of this kind of stuff, but to hear from somebody that was firsthand sort of on the scene for that kind of stuff, disturbing. I've talked to some of the other guys, as I've been mentioning, that are in law enforcement or former law enforcement, retired, and this kind of stuff, and the effect that has on people. I mean, that's just gruesome. I think it goes to my point I made at the end of this documentary that throughout all these investigations looking for creatures and Bigfoot and so-called monsters, the biggest monsters are always human beings, and that seems to be the case in the Bridgewater Triangle as well as in other places. So yeah, this just really, I wanted to include this part because it's, again, you can't talk about this area without mentioning this sort of stuff, and it was interesting to be able to include this.
Right around that same time is when the whole satanic cult murder case happened in Fall River, which is a city bordering Freetown. And that case involved the murder of 3 prostitutes from Fall River who were allegedly part of this satanic cult.
The murders actually took place 2 in Fall River and 1 in Westport. But their rituals took place in the state forest.
That same cult was allegedly conducting their rituals out in the Freetown State Forest. But none of this stuff has ever really been substantiated as far as the connection between the Freetown State Forest and the Fall River satanic cult. But around that same time, some evidence of ritualistic sacrifice started popping up in the Freetown State Forest. They would find the remains of animals inside of pentagrams, birds, goats, whatever. And at one point in the late 90s, they found a dozen baby calves that were butchered in the middle of the woods. Now, whether that was the work of a cult or not remains to be seen, but these bizarre occurrences of animals being mutilated and killed have been popping up in the Freetown State Forest for a long time. So you throw in the rumors of satanic worship and the mob hits and the abductions and people being lost out there in the suicides at the ledge. You throw all that into the melting pot, and the Freetown State Forest has developed this lore as this haunted location.
Yeah, so that again just shows you how this area, despite all the history, I mean, the very real impact it's had on people, actual crimes and murders, and people have died out here. And then you have all these other crazy stories, Bigfoot, Pukwudgies, and other stories a lot of people probably wouldn't believe, but there are very real world sort of consequences. So I felt it was important to include that when telling the story of the Bridgewater Triangle. Now, that's something I'd love to focus on, strange places, maybe down the line, do some Bridgewater Triangle stuff, absolutely. But I thought it was kind of a cool way to preface the Bridgewater Triangle when we talked about it in that kind of Bigfoot specific way. But as you can see throughout the whole episode, there's other strange stories, ghost stories, weird, mysterious rocks and other stuff in the episode. So it's not just one thing or another. It kind of encapsulated a lot. So I really like this episode. It's one of my favorites from that sort of 2022 period that we did. So yeah, now let's talk about another episode. All right, so the next one we're looking at is Smoky Mountain Sasquatch. This one is from 2022 also. This was one that I had done solo. There's actually a bit of a backstory behind this, the reason why I was down there. I was actually going to be speaking at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and I thought, hey, it'd be cool to tack on a video and go do a little backpacking trip. I'd only been down to the Smokies once before. I did a sort of wilderness survival course, and we had done a 2-week backpacking trip throughout the Smokies. And this was in November. This was way back when I was still in high school. So I was really excited to go back to the Smoky Mountains. But man, I did not know that in July it was that humid up in the mountains. I thought, where I'm here in the Northeast, it can be humid down in the flatter areas. But once you go up into the White Mountains or into the Green Mountains of Vermont, humidity kind of drops off. Man, boy, was I wrong when it came to the Smoky Mountains. So you can kind of see my misery a little bit as I'm backpacking a few miles solo into this area. I mean, I think I was sweating for 24 hours while I was out there. I was just constantly wet. I mean, it was just absolutely miserable. And I had to speak at the conference a couple days after this. Thankfully, I had a little bit of a day in between as like a buffer, but man, was that exhausting.
Now, something I do remember about hiking in the Smokies is how they're kind of considered to be the Green Tunnel. Well, at least the Appalachian Mountain range, the whole kind of Appalachian Trail, sort of known as the Green Tunnel. But I remember here in the Smokies, all these huge rhododendron, almost trees. That's how big they are, and it's green year round, which is pretty interesting. I just made it to the little backcountry camp I'm going to be staying at here for tonight. I'm going to probably set up camp now, maybe relax a little bit, and then explore the area, go check out the lake, check out the rest of the surrounding area.
Yeah, you could just see the agony on my face. I'm not a huge fan of humidity. I mean, I can tolerate it, of course, but I just didn't expect it to be that humid. Maybe that's just my mistake for not having researched that or looked it up previously. It's just rough down there. And you're thinking in the summertime you're going to get some reprieve, right? Even at night, all I heard was bugs all night long out there. So I barely had anything else going on that I could really hear. There's a couple things I thought I heard while I was solo camping out there, but it's really hard to tell when it's this kind of loud at night.
I don't really know what's going on. Just thought I'd kind of say what was happening. Just got out of the tent. It's about 9 a.m.
Oh my God, you can see in my face here, I look like I've been beat up. I barely got any sleep that night. It was just so humid and so loud. I'm not complaining. It's just really funny watching this now and remembering in the moment. I'm like, oh my God, I feel like I've been hit by a train or something. That's just how I felt. Obviously, once I got moving and got out of camp there, I felt a little bit better. But in the moment, I was not having it.
Slept okay, as comfortable as you can. Tent camping, never the best type of sleep, but I thought I heard a lot of weird noises out here, possible knocks, I don't know. Maybe I was imagining some of it, but I filmed my reaction to something hitting the tent. Happened multiple times. I filmed it after the second time, which I just thought was odd. Because the first time it woke me up out of my sleep and I felt it hit the tent, and then I heard rustling in the bushes, kind of to the left, to where the creek is. Then the second time, So that happened around 12:30. The second time was around 1 in the morning. And I was just dozing off and something again whacked the side of the tent. Now, was it something being thrown? Was it something falling? Perhaps. I mean, was it a toad jumping up on the tent? Maybe. This morning I found a toad in my boot.
Yeah, that was funny. There was a toad hanging out in my boot when I woke up. Good thing I didn't just put my foot in there. You know, I like to check it. I know down there they have rattlesnakes and cottonmouths, all that kind of stuff. But that's a good point I brought up about, you're alone, you're hearing stuff hitting your tent. It's easy to see how you could spin up a story of, oh my God, it was definitely a Bigfoot. You know, there's nothing else it could be. That's just silly. That's why I really try to take a pretty critical look at whenever I'm talking about any of this kind of stuff, or really try to debunk your own encounters, because most of the time it's probably something mundane that you're just sort of remembering or putting into an unusual category. I had no way to prove what that was. I did have that thermal camera pointed outside all night. That's only facing in one direction, so anything could be coming from the other direction. It might not even pick up an object like something just falling out of a tree unless it has a heat signature. So really hard to say with that sort of thing. But this was overall, it was a fun episode. It was a fun adventure for me, doing that kind of solo backpacking thing. I like going on these solo treks and pushing myself a little bit out of my comfort zone. Obviously, you're a few miles into the wilderness alone. You got to rely on yourself. It's not the ideal scenario. It's obviously best to be safe in numbers, but every once in a while, I guess I like trying to challenge myself a little bit, like I did with this episode. So yeah, that's Smoky Mountain Sasquatch. It was a fun one overall. I enjoyed making it. And now let's talk about some ones from 2023, so just from last year. Okay, the next episode is Tales of the Honey Island Swamp Monster from 2023. This one was a lot of fun to make. I've done a follow-up episode to it since then, going back to the Honey Island Swamp. For those that don't know, the Honey Island Swamp is a very primitive swamp in southern Louisiana. It's about 45 minutes north of New Orleans, and it goes along the Louisiana and Mississippi borders. It's a super cool area, and for years there's been stories of this Bigfoot-like creature known as the Honey Island Swamp Monster. Kind of a complicated story, but we'll get into watching a few clips, and then I'll kind of discuss some of the behind-the-scenes sort of stuff.
As for the Honey Island Swamp Monster, the story goes that in 1963, two men named Harlan Ford and Billy Mills encountered a strange creature while on their way to a hunting camp deep in the Honey Island Swamp. They claimed it was initially on all fours, digging for something in the ground, but then proceeded to stand on two legs and run off. Harlan Ford described the creature as large and baboon-like in nature, but with human-like eyes. After this encounter, Ford grew interested in the mystery and allegedly found a variety of strange four-toed footprints in the swamp, including this one in 1974. So this is a replica of one of the Honey Island Swamp Monster tracks. Now when I look at it...
Yeah, so this is the replica. I still have this thing. I got it from actually his granddaughter, Dana Holyfield. And it's a really cool kind of story. I think it's important to talk about, even though it's very likely hoaxed, as you'll see in a moment here as we continue the clip. But I think it's important to talk about this stuff when you're talking about this topic. Bring in the hoaxes, bring in the controversies that might be associated with the story. A lot of people say that the Honey Island Swamp Monster story originated in this 1960s period with the Harlan Ford story. I don't personally think so. People I've talked to and come to know now in that region, seems like the story goes beyond that point previously, rather, and has happened since then, independent of any kind of shenanigans here with the Ford track or anything like that. So yeah, the story, there's more depth to it, but I thought this was a really important segment to include.
Now when I look at it, I see some red flags. Biologically, this doesn't seem to really make sense. Three-toed footprints, almost looks like a alligator footprint, basically. So I don't know. I mean, to me, it doesn't really scream credibility. This footprint, in my view, shares a suspiciousness with similar alleged three- and four-toed tracks, like those found in the Everglades, allegedly of a skunk ape, and the infamous Beanfield track of the Fouke monster in Arkansas.
So yeah, you have these alleged three- and four-toed tracks that show up in the South primarily, and I just listed three of the more kind of well-known ones. You got the Honey Island one, the Beanfield track from Fouke, Arkansas, and the alleged skunk ape tracks from the Everglades. my opinion, none of those really seem legitimate from some of the background and some of the people involved, unfortunately. A lot of people point to these kind of tracks, and these are, again, some of the more well-known ones, but I think most of the ones, the credible ones that are even found in the southern states, are five-toed, that kind of thing. I mean, I know there's some people who argue there's a different species or something, but there's so little we really know that that's absolutely hard to say. But I thought it was interesting to draw a parallel to those other kind of 3- and 4-toed tracks.
The Ford track measures to about 10 inches in length and 5 inches wide by the toes. While in Florida recently, I was able to document and cast some large alligator footprints, which bear quite a resemblance to the Ford track, other than the claw placement. Most alleged Bigfoot prints have 5 toes, as that seems to be the norm. Some have suggested either a genetic deformity, or perhaps inbreeding, or even adaptation to living in a swamp as reasons for the 3 toes. But that still seems like a stretch to me. Perhaps the tracks simply aren't real, which would make the most sense, as Occam's razor dictates. There might even be evidence that conclusively proves the Ford track to not be real. In 2003, researcher and filmmaker Jay Michael, alongside longtime researcher M.K. Davis, were shown a pair of shoes with an alligator footprint attached to the bottom, allegedly discovered buried in mud near the area where Harlan Ford had made his hunting camp in the swamp.
That is cool. Let's take a good look at that. Yeah.
So it's kind of a little bit of a story behind how I got permission to use this footage from the filmmaker Jay Michael. Must have been, man, not even a week until the video was supposed to come out. I was, sort of editing it and finalizing things, and I was doing some searching online. I came across this video of this alleged track, and I said, "Oh my God! I mean, this is like a smoking gun, proving basically the Ford track is not real." So I had to reach out to Jay and say, "Hey, is there any chance I get permission to use this from you?" And I kind of started talking to him about my intentions of the project. He said, yeah, absolutely. And it was really cool. And I'm really glad he got back to me in a timely manner. A lot of times, sometimes you reach out to people, they don't get back to you. And this was sort of a spur of the moment, last minute sort of thing, which makes me even more glad that he got back to me and I was able to include it, because I think it's a very important part of that whole kind of Ford story.
According to Jay, the shoes were discovered in the late 1970s, and when confronted about it, Harlan Ford did not confirm or deny anything. At the time, it was known that the tracks were faked, and that local news even covered the discovery of the shoes, but that news never made it out nationally.
Here's the shoe along with photographs of known Honey Island Swamp casts and cast photos, including the original casts cast by Harlan Ford. The shoe print is the same size and width of the casts. It bears the same indentions where the toes begin. Even the telltale tilt of the middle toe can be seen in comparison to this cast photo. The bends and arches of each toe can be easily seen represented in the casts.
With my own rudimentary analysis, the alleged track and fake gator shoe line up quite nicely with one another.
Yeah, to deny that, you're basically denying an objective reality that these are almost an exact identical match. So that kind of spells the Ford track as being more than likely a hoax. Unfortunately, that does happen in this topic quite a bit. So again, that's why I thought it was important to bring it up and include it in the episode. It's part of the Honey Island Swamp Monster story. But as you can see, it's a documentary that's over an hour long. And that part about the Ford track and the Harlan Ford story is really only a small section of the documentary. So there's a lot more to the mystery than just that. But that is a component of it. It's a part of it. That's why I included it. Something just to add about this episode. This was an interesting episode to put together. I had various amount of people I was interviewing for this, covered different parts of Louisiana. And at the time I was there, it was extremely flooded and hard to get into any parts of the Honey Island Swamp on foot or with a vehicle and the few roads that go through that area. So getting in with a boat is pretty much your best bet and really the only kind of way to get in. But of all the people I interviewed, Dave, one of the guys I interviewed towards the end of the film, he actually, this was the craziest coincidence I think I've seen. And I kind of mentioned it a little bit in the film, but what had happened was I was filming. I stayed solo in one of the wildlife refuges out there, just kind of camped in my car, and I didn't have much service. So when I was leaving the area, I noticed I had some kind of a message request on Instagram, and it happened to be from this guy, Dave, who said he lives in the area. He happened to listen to me on a podcast called Bigfoot Crossroads. From months and months prior to this, I mentioned briefly, oh, I'd like to go to the Honey Island Swamp to do an investigation. Kind of like an off comment. I don't even remember making it. He messages me saying, hey man, I've had some stuff happen. My uncle used to kind of live out in the swamp and have stuff happen, and he's told stories. And if you're ever down here, I'd love to help you out with the film or help you out with an investigation, that sort of thing. And this is crazy, because imagine he had sent that message a week later, 2 weeks later. I would have been back home already, well out of Louisiana, but I happened to get that message while I'm in the Honey Island Swamp in Louisiana. I mean, and I had not posted. I don't do that kind of stuff when I'm on a trip. I'm busy, I'm focused. And I mean, there was really nobody that knew I was down there except for some of the few people that did, but Dave was just a random guy. So it was really interesting to get his message, and we talked over the phone, and we eventually met up and went out. Really cool guy. He's who I went out with filming this year when I did the follow-up to this episode in the Honey Island Swamp. So that was just a super cool coincidence. I don't know. You can't really make that sort of stuff up. The chance of that happening. I mean, sure, he could have messaged me before. We could have set something up, but he messaged me that while I was in the Honey Island Swamp, and I only had a couple days left when I was there. So again, he could have messaged me a few days after, and the ship would have already sailed. So sometimes things like that happen, and that's why this investigation is really cool. That whole New Orleans area, very interesting. A lot of weird, creepy history. The Honey Island Swamp, super interesting area, and I've loved going there. Doing 2 different films at this point about that story. I think I've covered it in quite a thorough manner. So that is the Tales of the Honey Island Swamp Monster from 2022, and there's also the that's the Tales of the Honey Island Swamp Monster from 2023, and there's also the follow-up, which came out a few months ago in 2024. So with that, we'll move on to our last few clips here. Okay, so now we're looking at the Alaska Bigfoot Highway from 2023, and man, this has to be one of my top favorite videos I've made in this series. It's like in the top 5 for sure. It's hard to pick. I mean, there's so many I've enjoyed making, and part of the experience is the journey. You go on the adventure, the investigation, and then the other part is actually crafting it into a video or a film, which it's a different it may come out differently than how you expected. But this one, I never even expected. So a lot of times with my planning for these sorts of videos, I have a rough plan. I have people I'm going to interview and talk to, but unexpected things can happen on the journey. This film was not planned at all. This was kind of a complete accident, which is kind of part of the cool behind the scenes story behind it. So I took this trip up to Alaska for a month where I was filming a variety of stuff, bunch of Beyond the Trail, as well as the entire Dark Coast Hunt for the Alaskan Bigfoot series, which was a direct follow-up to the Area A stuff in the Alaskan Coastal Sasquatch series from the year before that. So I drove up to Alaska, and I figured, man, the Alaska Highway, it's this incredible journey of a lifetime. It'll make for a really cool montage to put in one of my Alaska videos. Oh, here's the sequence going from part of Canada and into Alaska, the 1,400-mile Alaska Highway. That's all I thought it was going to be. It was just a sequence. I thought, maybe 5-10 minute little sequence that'll be within a film about Alaska. And along the way, a lot of stuff happened that it actually became its own film. We had a lot of kind of coincidental, funny stuff happen on this journey that you just can't really plan. And just, I was blown away at the scenery and everything in the journey, and it just felt like it should be its own video, and it became this sort of road trip journey. So we'll talk about a few clips from it, because man, it's still, again, one of my favorite journeys, one of my favorite films. I still think about it a lot.
this beautiful canyon. The water here is some of the nicest I've seen. Just in general, absolutely clean. You know, that's snow-fed mountain water. Incredible. We've reached this pretty awesome looking area of the canyon here. Wow, this area.
It was pretty wild to be in this canyon here in the northern Canadian Rockies. And something I should say is this journey to Alaska, it started at our event Monster Fest, which we did last year in the first weekend of June. So I drive to Ohio, do the event, and then I had 1 week between Monster Fest and the following weekend where we were going to be at this Boreal Bigfoot event in Fairbanks, Alaska. Had a week in between there to get to Alaska driving. I know that sounds crazy doing that in a week. Technically I had to be there by Friday, and Sunday to Friday. So the first 2 days I was with my brother, and that's why this video is such a personal journey for me, because I did it with my brother, and it was unexpected, and it turned into this incredible sort of really personal journey. And we drove from basically Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, to mile 0 of the Alaska Highway, which is Dawson Creek, British Columbia, thousands of miles away. We did that in 2 days. We basically didn't stop. We just kept driving. We would just take turns driving, and the other guy would sleep, so there was really no stopping. So yeah, that gave us basically from Tuesday to Friday to drive that 1,400 miles on the Alaska Highway to Fairbanks. And it gave us enough time to explore stuff along the way, and that's what was really cool, getting to check out places like this canyon.
It is pretty spectacular. Now, looking through all the reports, I haven't seen any sightings or anything from this park. There's sightings north of here and I guess east of here. But this habitat is pretty wild. There probably could be anything out here. We saw moose scat on the way up.
It was also pretty surreal going from being in Cleveland, Ohio on a Sunday, basically in the morning, to Tuesday afternoon. You're in the northern Canadian Rocky Mountains. I mean, it is really hard when you do a travel that quick to kind of understand, especially when you're driving. Something I should comment on is the windshield. A lot of people are saying, oh, why didn't you clean your windshield? Well, when you're on the Alaska Highway, the amount of bugs that you hit is absolutely absurd. Plus, it's not like you have really gas stations every few miles to try to clean it off or anything. It just wasn't a thing, and it didn't matter. Even if you did try to clean it off, you're just going to get another few thousand bugs splattered on there as you're driving up.
This section of the Alaska Highway was probably one of my favorites. Visually, it was something familiar in terms of landscape, reminding me of areas of the Colorado Rockies or even parts of northern Utah, but there was a different feeling. A real sense of isolation, knowing just how far north into British Columbia we truly were, in a part of the Rocky Mountains that is seldom traveled to, especially when compared to the tourist-heavy southern Canadian Rockies and the U.S. sections of the mountain range.
Yeah, that's something that can't be understated, how desolate it really felt up there. I mean, the only people really going through that area are folks like we were that are driving the Alaska Highway up to Alaska. There wasn't really any reason for anybody else to be going out there unless they live there, but it's extremely sparsely populated. This was probably the largest moose I have ever seen. Male moose. I mean, this thing was gigantic. I remember at the time I wasn't driving, my brother was, and I see this thing from the distance, and I'm like, there's no way. This is huge. And I've seen a lot of moose in my day, and it's one of those Yukon, northern Canadian moose, similar to the Alaskan, just absolute monsters, largest moose subspecies on Earth. So absolute unit of a creature. And it just casually strolled off into the woods. And we just couldn't believe looking at it, like that this was a real creature, how impressive and monstrous it actually was. And then it basically just disappeared into the tree line like it was nothing. Sound familiar? You know, so gives you kind of some perspective.
As we drove on, we began to exit this section of the Northern Rockies. The Liard River itself is actually the official northern terminus of the Rocky Mountains, which is quite impressive considering this mountain chain starts thousands of miles away in northern New Mexico.
So I'd never seen so many bears on the side of the road as during this time period. We saw, a dozen, I think, in the one night when we were driving through the last part of northern British Columbia into the Yukon. Tons of black bear, mostly black bear, I should say. Mostly black bear we were seeing, but we did see one grizzly, and that was really cool. So there's the grizzly we saw, just strolling on the side of the road, middle of nowhere in northern British Columbia. I mean, it was just really cool to see him. Just a reminder that it's no joke out there in those wild areas of northern Canada, and how few people there are, and how many bears, and probably more wildlife than there are people in some of those areas. But yeah, this Alaska Bigfoot Highway, as I mentioned earlier, is just one of my favorite films to put together. One of the other cool aspects about it was the coincidental nature of all the Bigfoot stories we were hearing, and the fact that we were driving to a Bigfoot event, the Memorial Bigfoot Expo in Fairbanks, Alaska, and along the way, I heard stories, and we were in Teslin, Yukon, and I got told by somebody there, oh, you got to talk to this guy, Red Grossinger. Well, so it turned out to be that he was going to be a speaker at the Boreal Bigfoot Expo, which I thought was really awesome. And I interviewed him and put him in the film. So that was this film kind of being made in real time. Again, it was not planned. It was supposed to be a sequence, and then these sort of things happened. I interviewed Red, I put some of his stuff about the Yukon there, and that's not where the coincidences end. When we hit the U.S. border with Alaska, the border agent is asking me, oh, what are you doing up here? I said, I'm up here for a month. I'm going to be looking for Bigfoot and doing some other stuff, but we're actually going to a Bigfoot event. He said, oh my God, do you know a guy named Mike Thompson? And I said, I do. He's also going to be one of the speakers at this event we are literally going to. That was Friday we entered into Alaska. That's when we'd be meeting Mike at the event that evening. I guess Mike used to work there at that border crossing near Tok, Alaska. And he was kind of known as the Bigfoot guy in that area. So that was really coincidental. And I got to include Michael. And what I thought was really cool about that was interviewing both Michael and Red. They essentially work the identical habitat. It's an identical type of nature on either side of the U.S. border and the Canadian side. When you're on the Canadian side or the U.S. side, the animals treated all the same. It looks the same, basically, right? So you have two guys that are researching Sasquatch in two of the most remote areas of North America, period, on either side of the border. And that's why I tried to kind of, when I interviewed them, try to compare, hey, what is your research like, or what are some of the encounters you've taken as compared to Michael? And they're basically the same. I mean, these guys are researching, as I said, an identical habitat that happens to be in two different countries. And I thought that was really cool how their research areas kind of combine, and it's just basically split up by an arbitrary border, which is obviously our border with Canada, which for the most part is just wilderness. So I thought that was really cool. But yeah, so that's the Alaska Bigfoot Highway. Definitely one of my favorites. I'm going to keep saying that just because I really enjoyed it, and it was a completely unexpected film that just came out of nowhere, and I was really glad to include it in some of my Alaska films, which to date have been some of my favorite to make and some of my favorite to create in that sort of creative process that I have. So yeah, we're going to talk about a couple more and then wrap the video up. Okay, so the last one we're going to talk about now, this video from 2024, is the Kenai Peninsula encounters, which is all about the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. And it was a really cool video to put together because this actually, you know, since we're on the Alaska topic, this was filmed during the same period as the Alaska Bigfoot Highway and Interior Tales from Alaska, as well as the Dark Coast series. This just happened to come out in early 2024, the way that scheduling and everything worked, and I had a few kind of tricks up my sleeve. I knew I wanted to do something about sort of the Kenai Peninsula. It's an area, of course, with so many different stories. Area A, Port Chatham, and there's the Les Stroud encounter. Les Stroud, someone very influential to me growing up, my love for the wilderness. Grew up watching Survivor Man. I remember hearing his weird encounter from the Kenai Peninsula. So in November of 2023, so last November, basically, I had gotten in touch with Les and figured out a time to do an interview to talk about his encounter because I knew I wanted to eventually put it in a video like this. And we have the Area A stuff with myself kind of recapping some of that Area A stuff, as well as Larry Beans Baxter talking about his Port Chatham experiences.
One of the more intriguing stories to come out of the Kenai Peninsula in recent times was by none other than Les Stroud, a Canadian survivalist and filmmaker, well known for his wildly popular Survivor Man TV series from the mid to late 2000s. During the filming of his second season of Survivor Man, while alone in a remote bay on the rugged southern coastline of the peninsula, Les had an encounter with something he would not forget anytime soon, and has seldom talked about it in great length.
It already felt different when I was there. So what's that mean? Different, you know? It means that for some reason, I legitimately, you know, had that thing where I'm going to say I felt like I was being watched. Now, that didn't surprise me at all because I was in, you know, bear territory and grizzlies. And so I just thought, you know, well, plus I also am well aware of the fact that when you're in the wilderness, you are always being watched anyway.
Yeah, it was really cool to interview Les about this. Really, I felt one of the more in-depth interviews about his encounter, that encounter before he did his Bigfoot show and all that stuff. This was something that I remember hearing this interview years ago, radio interview. So it was really cool to talk to him about that, especially having been to the Kenai Peninsula at that point myself quite a few times. That's what I really enjoyed about it. And it took actually quite a few times to get the schedule right that we could do the interview. We had to move it around a few days. And we did it like a virtual interview. So I interviewed him via Skype, that kind of thing. And then that's how I was able to use those clips because he's obviously up in Canada. I'm in the US. I couldn't just go up to Canada just to interview him. Would have been cool, but you know, obviously doing what's realistic. And I thought it was a really cool way to complete this sort of Kenai Peninsula documentary. You've got all the different areas that are being talked about, and then you have this Les Stroud story as well, which again always stuck out kind of in my mind.
Located at the geographic tip of the Kenai Peninsula, this area was once settled and was allegedly the site of some kind of violent incidents with Sasquatch-like creatures. Or so the story goes. Larry Beans Baxter likely knows more about the Port Chatham area than most people, having been there on multiple occasions and also having written one of the most decisive books on the topic, titled Abandoned: The History and Horror of Port Chatham, Alaska, which details a holistic view of the events and myths surrounding it, as well as his own personal experiences exploring the area.
I thought it was cool to cover the Port Chatham stuff. It gets hopelessly sensationalized with certain shows. There are others that are better about it and just talk about the story, but you have people that are kind of in this really either extreme believer camp or extreme skeptic when the truth seems a little bit more in the middle. There may have been legitimate encounters and stories before, but doesn't seem like that was responsible for kind of tearing up the town as some of the more sensationalized elements of the Port Chatham story go. But that's what was so cool about including Beans' testimony. And kind of behind the scenes here, a lot of this footage you see is from Area A. I mean, that's probably some of my favorite footage ever filmed with both drone and otherwise. Just that beautiful dark coast, majestic kind of fog-ridden Alaskan coastal environment, absolutely out of this world. And that's why I was really glad to be able to use a lot of that footage. And this episode was a little bit different than maybe some of the other Beyond the Trails, which are following me or my team or somebody, and we're out there kind of investigating. I do like to switch up the style every once in a while with Beyond the Trail and do more of an episode that's just about a region or an area and feature other investigators and people telling their stories. So that's kind of what this episode sort of was. I knew I wanted to do something again on that Kenai Peninsula habitat.
I was fishing with my uncle, and we were right next there. We were in Chrome Bay, just on the other side of Port Chatham there. And as we were trolling for salmon, we went right by there. My uncle pointed at that bay and he said, you know, they moved a whole village in ancient times to the next bay over from here because Bigfoot were killing people.
So this is a funny story, kind of linking up with Chook. Chook is somebody, I actually had followed his stuff previously to me knowing him. I came across some of his gun reviews and stuff. And I saw that, and I saw he was doing some Alaska Bigfoot stuff, and he was in the Alaska Triangle show, I believe. And so I linked up with him, and while I was in Alaska, somehow either he messaged me first or I messaged him. I don't remember how it exactly went down, but we thought, hey, man, maybe we should link up. Maybe that'd be really cool. So that's when we ended up doing that. And he grew up in Homer, which is very close to Port Chatham. I mean, it's the closest place to get to Port Chatham. So he knew those stories growing up in that area, as he talks about in the episode here. But that was cool to link up with him, and obviously I interviewed him for some of the other Alaska-related projects. But it's kind of the creative madness of it all. When I'm on a trip, like this was a month-long trip, and I'm doing, I think I did 3 or 4 Beyond the Trails, and then an entire Dark Coast series. So you kind of see the level of intensity, and you're out there. I mean, we're camping out in the woods and really in the wilderness majority of that time. So that's sort of how it kind of all comes together, and making these connections and either having people reach out to me or I reach out to them. And there's a lot of good synergy and a lot of kind of coincidental stuff that happens along the way. So yeah, that's what I really liked about this episode. And even though it happened, I filmed it last year, came out early this year, and it's one that I really enjoy. And I love being able to focus on that Kenai Peninsula habitat. So there you have it. Conclude with that one there as one of the more modern ones. We'll have obviously more videos coming out this year of Beyond the Trail. I'm doing a lot more other stuff now too, with strange places and that sort of stuff. But yeah, I wanted to take the time just to do this sort of, I guess, behind the trail, behind the scenes, a little bit of commentary, some fun stories, that sort of stuff. See, I don't know, hopefully you guys will like this kind of thing. Just something I had been wanting to do for a while, and share some of these stories, because you see how much effort and work we put into these films and how much of ourselves we pour into them. And sometimes a lot of the behind the scenes stuff just doesn't make it in there, whether or not it's supposed to. There's just obviously going to be a lot going on in the background that, I'll talk about when I do podcasts and that sort of thing, but it's not really something I get to share with you, the audience. So hopefully you guys will appreciate some of the kind of behind the scenes stories. And if you guys like this, maybe we'll do something like this down the line with some other episodes and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. Again, hopefully you guys enjoyed it. This was a lot of fun for me to kind of reminisce a little bit and go all the way back to the origins of Beyond the Trail, how far we've come. It's been obviously a long time coming. I mean, when we first started doing the videos, we had a very small YouTube channel. It's obviously grown since then, and now the videos are going on other platforms as well. But it's just been an awesome journey, and I've really enjoyed it very thoroughly. And there's plenty more awesome adventures coming up and plenty more documentaries I'm very excited about. I'm not going to spoil anything, but with stuff coming up with Beyond the Trail, Strange Places, lots of other stuff, there's just a lot of excitement at Small Town Monsters in general. I mean, I'm just one creator here at the channel, so there's a bunch of us. A lot of us are doing our own projects and in different directions, and this is the kind of stuff that I like to do. And it's been awesome so far. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm going to wrap it up and stop talking now. Thank you guys for checking it out, and definitely stay tuned for more Beyond the Trail adventures coming soon.